Good morning, church. Glad that you're here. I want to invite you to take your Bibles and turn to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12. Luke, chapter 12. It'll also be on the screens above us. The title of this message this morning is titled, Greed. It's Not What You Thought I Meant. And we're going to look into Luke, chapter 12, the entirety of it, but our primary text for this morning is here in verse 13. So if it's comfortable for you to do so, would you stand for the reading of the Lord's Word as I read it for us? Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this night your very life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. In one of the less prominent of Jesus' parables, we find Jesus in front of thousands of people. In verses 1 through 13, we know that there are throngs of people that are following Jesus around. Everywhere he goes, there seems to be a crowd. And when you have that many people that are surrounding you, sometimes it's hard to get a word in with just a few people that you want to connect with. For Jesus, this time that he has with his disciples is no different. But yet he chooses to seize a moment with them to have a word, a teaching point, a word of instruction that he finds necessary to speak on. In spite of the many listening ears that are around him, he begins to talk with them privately in front of all these people. Now, maybe he's just being coy. Maybe as he shares these words with his disciples, he intends for everybody else to listen. I don't know. But the message that he delivers to them is hardly cryptic, even if his intended audience might be. He says, "Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." The scheming of the Pharisees, their conniving, is exposed to the disciples and really anybody else within earshot who might be listening. He reveals the intentions of the Pharisees, and they're not pure. They have a plan. And that plan, hatched in the cover of darkness, will someday be exposed. Truth be told, the message is obviously much broader than just the Pharisees. Small things, like yeast, seem to matter in our understanding of the Christian life. Faith like a mustard seed, a bit in a horse's mouth, one small spark, one smooth stone against a giant, the rudder of a ship, little children, one small apple in a garden. By the way, it's probably not an apple, but I don't want to blow your theology up right now. The yeast of the Pharisees, a small thing. Rick Warren says, in the Bible, yeast is often a metaphor for pride and arrogance. Why? When you put yeast in dough, what does it do? It puffs it up. And if you put it in too much, it blows it up. When you're cooking, you don't need a lot of yeast. If you're making bread, you don't pour a cup of yeast in. You just need a little pinch. Just like yeast, you don't have to have a lot of pride for it to take over quickly and get you in all kinds of problems. The underlying secret, the hidden motives of the Pharisees will someday be revealed. Their agendas will blow up. Their true intentions made known, and they will be exposed. The warnings against such yeast is only that it takes a small amount of arrogance, pride, greed, self-indulgence. And when those things are left unchecked, even just a small amount grows and grows bigger than we ever believed possible. My dad likes to say that sin will take you farther than you ever imagined. And sadly, many of us in this room know that to be true. Not only is the warning against the yeast of the Pharisees a warning against how such small things can find their ways into our hearts and destroy us from the inside out, there is a double meaning in this warning that speaks to the very real threat that the pride, arrogance, and greed of the Pharisees will put the disciples in very serious, life-threatening risk. So here we have in verses 1 through 12 this rich concern of Jesus speaking to his disciples and anyone who can listen about pride, arrogance, and greed, and how they can destroy a follower of Jesus, both inside and out. Now, as I mentioned, our primary text is verses 13 through 21, and it takes a rather abrupt turn. So as Jesus is talking, all of these people around, and Jesus is addressing his disciples, and he's talking about the yeast of the Pharisees and to watch out. Somebody shouts out from the crowd, "Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, I think it's important for us to note, and just to give you a little bit of maybe understanding, that particularly the Gospels, not all of them are written in chronological order. In fact, it is a practice in ancient literature that they would intentionally take things out of chronological order and place things in a thematic order. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that the words that they're saying are made up or anything like that, but he is taking a theme and putting them all together. And I think that's an important thing for us to understand, because the point is more important than the chronology or the order in which things take place. My reason for bringing that up is we would do the Gospel of Luke, especially chapter 12, a disservice if we didn't understand it in its entirety. This is not a bunch of little stories that are not interwoven or connected to one another. Particularly the preceding text and the text we read today and the following are all interwoven together and form one focused and cohesive theme. Luke 12 is about a parable of our values. It's not a parable necessarily just about money. Jesus is telling a parable about values, not necessarily money. Now, in one sense, of course it's about money. I mean, it stinks of greed, but really at the heart, at the root, when you take all of these things together, this is a parable about values. We pull all those things together. Luke intends for us to understand that beyond the value of money, this is a story of our misplaced values. More to the point, it's a story to help us understand how the yeast of the Pharisees is about their values and their misplaced values. They value power and influence. They value position and prestige more than they value the living God. They have set their priorities, and those priorities are heavily influencing their lives. And at some point, those priorities will drive them to persecute the disciples and expose them before God as people who are really, truly far from him, not close to him at all. Money in this scene is but one element of this narrative. Look again at verse 15 of chapter 12. It reads, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. All kinds of greed is a lesson about our hearts. Again, let's draw this whole thing into focus. Possessions can be anything. It's not just money. Remember, for the Pharisees, money was only one slice of the pie. Material possessions were yet another slice, but so was power and influence. The warning is to watch out and be on our guard against all kinds of greed, which implies that there are many, many different facets of greed that extend beyond that of money and material possessions. Life is bigger, after all, than these things. This is a lesson about our hearts. When things that we value displace the Christ-centered lives that we are called to, it diverts our attention from the will of God, and we become puffed up with self-importance. The yeast of the Pharisees, puffing us up. Our hearts can easily begin to perceive life then as a scoreboard. Am I winning or am I losing? Whose life is better than mine? How can they have that and I don't have it? We become distracted and we cease to do all the necessary things that bring about a fruitful end. There are all kinds of ways that greed, envy, jealousy, comparisons, the haves and the have-nots, they can begin to destroy us from the inside out because we have let the yeast of greed into our hearts. Now, the natural byproduct of that is greed prevents us then from being rich towards God. Verse 20 says, "But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God.'" In one of our home builders lessons, Andy Stanley spoke about raising children that were experience rich but relationship poor. When the yeast of greed sneaks into our lives, it changes our values. It reveals a discontented heart, and it draws us further and further and further away from God. We are rich in experiences. Vacations, camps, entertainment, screens, devices, homes. We are rich in experiences. Listen to these words from Veruca Salt. You remember Veruca Salt from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory? "I want the world. I want the whole world. I want to lock it all up in my pocket. It's my bar of chocolate. Give it to me now." You remember that? She wanted the world locked up in her pocket. In many ways, we have the world in our pockets, those little devices. I mean, think about how much information we have at the touch of a button. In fact, buttons are too cumbersome. We don't even have phones with buttons anymore. We are rich in stuff. Financially, probably everybody in this room is more wealthy than 90% of the rest of the world's population. We are so rich by the rest of the world's standards. Now, might I add that we too, as a church, are experience rich. We have programs and activities, a wonderful building. We have wonderful services. Well, not this one, but most of them. Wonderful times that we get together. We have a wonderful pavilion that's going up. We are experience rich. Are we relationship poor? Are we doing what is necessary to build a richness in our relationship with God and others in Jesus' church? I'd encourage us to ask ourselves a couple of questions. What are we willing to set aside so that we have a richness in our relationship with God and others in Jesus' church? What are we willing to set aside? to have a richness in our relationship with God and others in Jesus' church? What are we willing to set aside in our children's lives to make room for a rich relationship with God that will exist beyond their leaving our homes? I say again, greed. It's not what you thought I meant. This is a parable about our values. This is a lesson about our hearts. And according to Jesus, we need to be on guard against all kinds of greed, which says to me that it's pretty easy to get duped by good things and ignore the best. Ultimately, though, greed reveals a lack of trust and has eternal consequences. All kinds of greed is about trust. In the life of a follower of Jesus, and honestly, even those who are not followers of Jesus, the root is about trust. Do we trust God to provide our needs, or do we find him to be inadequate? I don't like the sound of that word, that I would suggest that God is somehow inadequate. When we don't trust, we live in fear. And when we live in fear, we want to control everything. Anybody else in the room a control freak? You guys are lying dogs. 2 years, I've been able to figure out which ones are control freaks and which aren't. I don't have a list or anything, I'm just saying. If we find in God that he is more than able, in other words, he's not inadequate, he's more than adequate, then what happens is then we can release that control. We can release our anxieties. We can release our fears because we trust him to be who he says he is and do what he says that he will do. We can trust in him. We believe in him. Listen to some of these verses in Luke that follow the text that we read earlier today. It might help to remember that these words are in red letters in my Bible, which means that they are spoken from the very mouth of Jesus. Luke 12, verse 22 through verse 30. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds? Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? Do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after such things, and your Father knows that you need them." This should be really reassuring language to followers of Jesus. God knows what you need. Not only does he know what you need, Jesus says that he will provide what you need. Verse 28 says that when we don't trust God to deliver on his promises, it's a reflection back on our lack of trust in him. In fact, he goes on to imply that when we view God as an inadequate provider, we become a people who run after such things. We do not demonstrate our faith in God when we run after such things. In fact, he says that such a person is a pagan. So what is a pagan? Webster's dictionary says, a follower of a polytheistic religion, one who has little or no religion and who delights in sensual pleasures and material goods, an irreligious or hedonistic person. You see, this is why greed reveals a lack of trust, and it has eternal consequences. When you lack trust in God and you cease to exercise your faith and you place your sensual pleasures and material goods on the throne, then we stop pursuing God and we start pursuing such things. It doesn't really matter what the such things are or the such persons are. We are pursuing something other than God. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24 from the Message says, you can't worship two gods at once. Loving one God, you'll end up hating the other. Adoration of one feeds contempt for the other. You can't worship God and money both. Now, many of us know that the word money is actually the word mammon is in the original text, and it means something different than just money. And in fact, many times the word mammon is capitalized because it takes on a God-like personification in the life of a person. And oftentimes the word mammon is capitalized because of its deified type state. It is about money and possessions, wealth and possessions, but is also about something bigger, something broader in context. It's whatever we put in a place of prominence above or even alongside of God. It's not just about wealth and possessions. It can be anything. Therefore, greed has eternal consequences. It separates us from God because we begin to pursue such things rather than pursuing God. Now, is it a good time to remind us that in the ancient world, spouses and children were also a measure of a person's wealth? I'm going to let that sink in for a second. Our families are a blessing from God, but they too can fit into the category of mammon. Many of us, myself included, can easily pursue such things as our families. And it seems noble and it seems right. I mean, God wants us to take care of our families. But if we're not careful, our perspectives, our priorities can begin to pursue such things rather than pursuing the Almighty and living God. So do we trust God to provide? The answer to that question appears to have eternal consequences. So where does greed reveal itself? I'm going to give you three things, and I'm going to give them to you quickly. I'm going to give them to you all at once. So if you're taking notes out there and you're doing it for candy, get your pencils ready. Okay, Lucy and Sawyer are ready. They want this candy. They don't care about anything else I say as long as they get the candy words right. Okay. Greed reveals itself in the priorities we keep. This is where greed reveals itself. It reveals itself in the priorities we keep. It also reveals itself in what keeps us up at night. So it reveals itself in the priorities we keep, in what keeps us up at night, and greed reveals itself in a shallow relationship with God. Three things: the priorities we keep, what keeps us up at night, and a shallow relationship with God. So Steve, keep those up on the screen so the kids can write them down since they are learning how to write well. Now, there's not a whole lot of explanation that's necessary from this. Greed reveals what's important to us. It reveals what we're anxious about. It reveals how deep or maybe how important our relationship with Jesus is. Forgive me because I would never have allowed this in the classroom at any of the colleges that I taught in. I'm going to quote Wikipedia. But I thought it actually was halfway decent. Greed or avarice is an inordinate or insatiable longing for material gain. be it food, money, status, or power. As a secular psychological concept, greed is an inordinate desire to acquire or possess more than one needs. Greed will set your priorities. It will keep you up at night, worrying and thinking about what it's like and what you need and what you think you deserve. It's like yeast. It only takes a little bit to blow the whole thing up. Why? Because greed is insatiable. When we extend beyond what we need, we run a risk of pursuing a moving target that is insatiable. Wasn't it Rockefeller said when somebody asked him how much money is enough? His response, just a little bit more. I'd like to bring us towards a conclusion by watching a brief video on the science of greed. The research done by Paul K. Pilf at UC Berkeley is a fascinating study on how people respond to greed and people who have access to resources that others don't. And some of it's hard to hear. There are some subtitles, so kind of hone in a little bit and follow along as they do this video.
So we ran a study on the UC Berkeley campus to look at exactly that question. We brought in more than 100 pairs of strangers into the lab, and with the flip of a coin, randomly assigned one of the two to be a rich player in a rigged game. They got 2 times as much money. When they passed go, they collected twice the salary, and they got to roll both dice instead of one, so they got to move around the board a lot more. Okay, so it was quickly apparent to players that something was up. One person clearly has a lot more money than the other person, and yet, as the game unfolded, we saw very notable differences and dramatic differences begin to emerge between the two players. The rich player started to move around the board louder, literally smacking the board with their piece as he went around. We were more likely to see signs of dominance and nonverbal signs of displays of power and celebration among the rich players. All right, we had a bowl of pretzels positioned off to the side. It's on the bottom right corner there. That allowed us to watch participants' consumatory behavior. So we're just tracking how many pretzels participants eat.
I love pretzels.
And as the game went on, one of the really interesting and dramatic patterns that we observed begin to emerge was that the rich players actually started to become ruder toward the other person. Less and less sensitive to the plight of those poor players, and more demonstrative of their material success. More likely to showcase how well they're doing.
I have some money. I have money for everything. You owe me $24 before. Lose all your money soon. I'll buy it. I mean, I have so much money. I have so much money, it takes me forever.
I'm gonna buy out this whole board.
You're gonna run out of money soon. I'm pretty much untouchable at this point.
Okay, and here's what I think was really interesting, is that at the end of the 15 minutes, we asked the players to talk about their experience during the game. And when the rich players talked about why they'd inevitably won in this rigged game of Monopoly, they talked about what they'd done to buy those different properties and earn their success in the game. And they became far less attuned to all those different features of the situation, including that flip of a coin that had randomly gotten them into that privileged position in the first place. And that's a really incredible insight into how the mind makes sense of advantage. As a person's levels of wealth increase, their feelings of compassion and empathy go down. And their feelings of entitlement, of deservingness, and their ideology of self-interest increases. In surveys, we found that it's actually wealthier individuals who are more likely to moralize greed being good and that the pursuit of self-interest is favorable and moral.
Some really interesting insights into the mind of the greedy. So how do you know when greed has crept into your heart? Ironically, the next 4 points are actually from a study that I did with the teens called The Boss, and they're reflected in the video that we just showed. Here's how you know when greed has crept into your heart. When you prioritize stuff over people. Many of us have seen people, maybe we've even done that. We prioritize our stuff over people. You know when greed has crept into your heart when you always want more stuff. You know that greed has crept into your heart when you're hesitant to share your stuff. And you know that greed has crept into your heart when you find your identity in your stuff. And that's really when things start to get scary. Now, if you notice in the video, people with advantage, the ones with the most, became much more likely to forget the advantages that they received, the privileges that they were given by no effort of their own. They began to attribute their success to themselves, their blessings to themselves. In other words, they began to take credit for things that they themselves did not do. In fact, it was given to them. If we as followers of Jesus believe that every good and perfect gift comes from above, then when we allow greed to make its way into our hearts, then we are far more likely to forget about the kingdom of God and think of ourselves as self-made men and women. We begin to believe that our blessings are the result of our own efforts, not from God. You saw compassion and empathy go down, self-importance and entitlement go up. But here's the key concept. You combat greed by seeking the kingdom first. You combat greed by seeking the kingdom first. Well, how do I begin to seek the kingdom first? You begin to seek the kingdom first by prioritizing people over stuff. You begin to seek the kingdom first when you are content with what you have. We begin to seek the kingdom first when we freely share what we've been given. And we begin to seek the kingdom first when we find our identities in Christ more than possessions, status, power, and even parenting. In conclusion, preach a sermon on greed and then make a mistake and say that the ushers are going to come back in for another offering. That was not my intention at all. We're going to invite the worship team, who is not going to ask for any money whatsoever.